All right, hello and welcome everybody. Today, I am gonna probably do a short series, a couple, at least three videos, talking about things I think that my upcoming novel does well. And so my goal is kind of to break down a few different areas where I see certain things in modern fiction that I kind of not necessarily dislike, but think are getting a little bit overused or maybe overdone. And I want to talk about the things that I kind of did in the book to try and maybe lightly push back against some of these trends. And so, this first episode is going to be about characters and character writing. And well, I don't want to point at anyone specifically. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to list a few tropes that I think are a little bit too common these days in modern character writing, and then talk a little bit about how what I'm trying to do to kind of push back against those tropes to a certain degree. So, without naming names necessarily, think about whether you've seen enough or too much of any of these things recently, and if you might be interested in something that goes against these traits. So, point number one. A lot of characters these days, what they'll do is they'll kind of like either they'll pull rank at the drop of a hat. It's always the case that, not always, but it's often the case that, like, oh, somebody has an idea and they have to go around their superior in order to do that. And this kind of thing happens a lot in modern fiction, in my kind of view. And to make it even worse, we have a lot of superiors that give bad orders, and a lot of subordinates that disobey reasonable orders, right? And there are of course some writers that do a pretty good job of maintaining this kind of rank structure to a certain degree, but sometimes they even get too rigid, right? Like everything is rank is also, I think, something that we see a lot. We get a lot of bad superiors in general in recent fiction. They're prevalent. And a lot of subordinates who are better in every way than the people who, supposedly work over them. And this is a real thing, right? Like, the Peter Principle is real. But on some level, I feel like people who have been writing in, recent times have focused too much on the Peter Principle and not on the possibility that there are some people who actually earned their positions and are doing pretty well. And this is especially true of, like, really small organizations, right? In a big organization, you can kind of diffuse responsibility until someone can get pretty far above their competence level before someone realizes that they're out of their area, right? Out of the things that they can possibly do. But for small organizations, like you see in a lot of books, you'll see these people that somehow got 4 ranks higher than they really deserve, even though there's not really a good way for them to diffuse responsibility if anybody is looking at anything in the group. Another thing that we see a lot these days are characters who almost always succeed at their tasks. And, even when they don't succeed, it seems like, and it's normal for people to succeed more often than not at tasks that they're deliberately specialized at, right? But at the same time, we have this issue where these characters doing these difficult tasks seem to have no sense of their own fallibility as they prepare and do these tasks. The only time that they really acknowledge their fallibility is right after a big failure, as opposed to someone who's, like a good engineer who's like, well, I mean, these are the figures that I got, but let's check them against some other things. Let's make a scale model kind of thing. A real professional, a real specialized person who's working well at a task has ways to kind of check whether what he's done or meshes with reality. And we don't see that a lot. We see a lot of, like, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. Suddenly they can't do this, and only then are they like, well, I made a mistake, and now I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. That kind of headstrongness is almost a type of plot armor, because, generally speaking, if there is a failure, it's for some really, poignant plot purpose, right? And so like it's important that they get back on the horse and not doubt themselves, kind of thing. And so I feel like that's something I see a lot these days. They're just these characters that never really check their work before they push enter, kind of thing. And real professionals often do check their work before they hit send. Another thing I see a lot is disagreements that lead to these immediate splinters between characters that are very, very deep, where characters rarely discuss their differences and come to agreement. You end up with these little feuds or fights or cases where one person, the POV character, knows best, and therefore there's no point in arguing against the person that has a differing opinion. Another thing that we see a lot these days, especially in like science fiction, and this is more like pop science fiction, like I'm thinking, like TV shows or something like that, where there's like some new and never before seen phenomenon that suddenly appears, and some scientist, some engineer solves it and says, "Oh yeah, we have a solution for this. It'll only take 5 minutes." They think about it for 3 seconds. They're like, "Oh yeah, we can do that. We can technobabble, and we can solve this in 5 minutes." Whereas if you're actually an engineer or a scientist and you see something that you've never ever seen before, you do kind of have to take a step back and say, "Well, maybe we could try this, or maybe we could try this, or maybe we could try this." And there are kind of some options. You don't have complete information, and so you're not sure whether your proposed solutions will work. But you're like, well, depending on how urgent things are, we could try this. If we study it a little bit longer, maybe we can come up with a different way around this problem, that kind of thing. So when I was writing this book, I kind of had 5 planks that I kind of tried to stay conscious of when I was writing the characters in this book, because all the characters in the book, even the bad guys, are professionals. They're good at what they do, and they've been doing it for a long time. And so I came up with these 5 planks that I used to kind of help to make sure that I didn't fall into any of these common tropes of character that we see these days. So those 5 planks are professionalism, respectability, specialization, competence, and fallibility. And they kind of have a little overlap, but they're all a little bit different. And so I thought I would give you guys some examples of parts in the story, plug, right? Parts in the story where the characters kind of exemplify these 5 planks, in hopes that you'll say, "Ooh, that does sound kind of interesting. I want to see how these characters, how this situation is dealt with by these characters while, kind of meeting these 5, general rules of action." So let's start with professionalism, right? Examples and things. There's 3 different things that I think kind of exemplify professionalism that I can come up with examples from my story. First one would be something where characters argue, that is, they're in major disagreement, but what they do instead of just bickering is they attempt to reach consensus. They treat each other as acting in good faith, and they kind of try to figure out what the potential solutions are. So there's one point early in the book where Lou comes up with this idea that makes... So they're trying to find a ship that's owned by the Orland Corporation. And Lou comes up with an idea that makes the Orland Corporation look a little bit bad, right? It's like, well, what if this happened, right? And he brings it to the company rep. They're having a briefing, which is another thing we kind of miss a lot in modern stuff. Generally speaking, if you're briefing someone, you want to give them as much information as you think might be relevant that you possibly can have. A lot of the times we see briefings kind of dusted over because it's boring. But anyway, Lou brings this idea to the company rep. And the company rep, rather than being like, "Oh, I have no idea about that," the company rep looks at his arguments in good faith and tries to provide additional info that might mitigate the situations that would arise if Lou was right. And so they they're in the middle of this briefing, and Lou brings up this thing, and there's this fun point where Eric's like, "Well, Lou, do you want to give this talk, or do you want me to give it?" And Lou's like, "No, I'll do it." And so Lou brings up this idea, and the Orland representative kind of frowns and thinks about it a little bit, and he's like, well, that's possible. Let's look at the data that we have about the crew of the Heliotrope and see if there's anything that we can gather from that, related to your idea. Fair enough. They talk about it. They come to a conclusion. There's even a point where they're like, where Lou is like, I hope I'm wrong, but just in case, we need to prepare for this contingency. So I thought that was kind of a fun example for that. We have another case where they're trying to figure out how to track a group through space. And Bill, who is the navigator for Eric's company, she and Wyatt have two different ideas, and they kind of talk about the pros and cons of both, and they both come to the conclusion that while Wyatt's ideas might work, they would probably take too long and be too slow. And so in the meantime, they're going to try Bill's idea, and then they have a fallback idea if that doesn't work. It's kind of a neat, kind of back and forth that they have. And, again, they do it in the presence of other people, and there's some kind of back and forth, people asking questions. There's a lot of, I try to put in not too much, but I try to put in a decent amount of this kind of dialogue so that we can get an idea of how the characters are thinking and how they're specialized and what kinds of blind spots they have and what kinds of ideas they come up with. And I feel like that really helps to give the characters a little bit more flavor and a little bit more interesting depth that at least I find intriguing. So point number 2 about professionalism is the use of professional language and tone. And there's a lot of cases these days where you'll see like everybody's, cursing like a sailor kind of thing. There's no respect between superiors and subordinates in either direction kind of thing. There's a lot of like, I said to do this, so you do this kind of thing. But I tried to kind of push against that in these 3 places, at least these 3 places. So Orland Corporation is a big corporation, a big, mining corporation that is hiring Eric and his team, and Eric is subcontracting Wyatt and his team for security purposes. The Orland Company rep is not demanding or haughty or superior, he doesn't have a superior air to the people that he's hiring. He's like, well, okay, you guys are the specialists in doing this job, and, I want you to succeed at it, and so, I'm going to, be respectful to you, and, hopefully you'll be respectful back, and we'll discuss the situation. I'll get you whatever information that I can as fast as I possibly can. I'll be receptive to reasonable requests, that kind of thing. There's a point where they're searching a ship for traps, and there's a great page and a half where, at least page and a half at 8.5 by 10. So it's probably a couple of pages in the smaller book. But Wyatt is the commander of this company that does security work. And this character, Ignacio, but he's just called Iggy throughout the story, because I thought that was fun. Iggy is working to actually clear this particular area of traps that have been set. And there's kind of a very professional tone between Wyatt and Iggy as they're both as Wyatt is kind of helping to direct Iggy and make sure he doesn't make any mistakes, and Iggy is trying to report what he's seeing back to Wyatt so that they can understand what's going on. Wyatt puts a lot of trust in Iggy, and Iggy puts a lot of trust and respect toward Wyatt as well. And they talk to each other very professionally. There's even some slurs and stuff in there. But not too much kind of thing. And then the third thing that I wanted to talk about is that there's this one point where Bill makes a mistake. She's trying to do some navigation work, and she basically makes a mistake that is actually pretty dangerous. And then after they get out of danger and everything, basically Eric has to criticize Bill and be like, can you act? Part of our plan was for you to do this thing 5 times, and we tried it the first time, and it didn't go well. Can you actually do this? But he doesn't yell at her in the presence of everybody else. He sits in his captain's chair and he's like, look, he waits for Lou to kind of go do some engineering stuff. He's like, look, is this actually something you can do, or do we need to come up with a new plan? And they actually talk about it. And it's like, I respect your skills, but we really can't, screw this up again. And we were lucky that this screwing it up this time didn't actually have like these super negative effects. And Bill's like, you're right. I think I can do it. Let me try it one more. Give me one more chance, and if it doesn't work, we'll come up with something else, kind of thing. Here's why. She also says, like, here's what I think went wrong. Here's what I think I can fix for next time. That kind of stuff. And they don't yell at each other. They don't talk down to each other, and they don't get huffy when they're criticized either. And then the third point about professionalism that I think is demonstrated in my story in a couple of places is that ranks are respected but not worshipped, right? Because you don't want to go to the point where like nobody cares anything about rank at all. That you end up with a chaotic situation. But at the same time, the people who have rank, who have higher ranks, should demonstrate that they got there for a reason, right? So, for instance, there's a point where Eric, who has subcontracted Wyatt's group, is like, always treat your contractors with respect, kind of thing. And he does it at his own expense. And there's a funny joke in there that I'm not going to spoil, but I really like that little point there, because it both shows that Eric thinks a lot about the people that are, this is a security company. So these people are actually, handling the really dangerous jobs, the really dangerous work. And, but at the same time, Eric hired them. So, he's like, always treat your contractors with respect, kind of thing, and always be professional with them, kind of thing. And there's a funny joke in there as well. At least I think it's funny. Number 2 would be that occasionally there are direct orders given, right? There is a hierarchy, and generally speaking, what happens is that the commanding officer says, or not commanding officer, but the boss, whoever the boss happens to be in this particular case, says, we need to do this, who wants to do it? And someone raises their hand and volunteers, great. There are occasional times where someone makes a direct order, right? Like, do this now and do it, just get it done. But generally speaking, those direct orders are given for the benefit of the subordinate rather than for the ego of the superior. I find that's something that doesn't happen a lot in modern fiction, where you genuinely get a sense that when the superior puts his foot down somewhere, he's doing it, notably and visibly for the benefit of the person at whom he's putting the foot down. So I thought that was kind of a nice thing that I did in this story. Plank number 2, respectability. So we see sometimes where there's no respect at all. We see sometimes where subordinates respect their superiors. But another thing I wanted to add was that superiors respect their subordinates too. That it's a two-way street. So, I mentioned Wyatt and Iggy talking together. When Iggy's doing the trap disarming, or the trap search, and Wyatt is kind of, on the ship doing in a command role, they're both respecting each other. They're both offering opinions. They're both giving advice back and forth, kind of thing. Wyatt is very respectful towards Iggy's skills, and Iggy is very respectful towards Wyatt's skills. Point 2, there's a point at which Lou is fixing some random stuff on the bridge, and like Eric looks at him funny, like, what are you doing? He's like, this looks stupid, but it's not stupid and it's not dangerous, so don't worry. Let me put it away for the moment until we get underway, kind of thing. At this point, Eric could be like, don't do that when we're getting ready to head out, kind of thing. But he doesn't scold him. He just kind of gives him a little bit of a look, and Lou handles it quickly, and he handles it quickly without like saying, oh, I can't believe I have to handle this. He's like, oh yeah, I did kind of screw up having this stuff out when it really should be put away and stowed properly. There's a point where Lou has to do some repairs on a ship, and not only does Lou respect Eric's order, Eric asking him to do the repairs, but Eric also recognizes that Lou really knows what he's talking about and puts significant trust in him. There's a point at which Eric doesn't see a problem with something, but Lou is like, you know, this looks good, but I think that there might be something that could deteriorate over time that we need to be aware of. And Eric's like, okay, I trust your opinion. You're the engineer. We'll do it your way. On piloting, you know, Eric, in a couple of points, Eric recognizes that Bill is piloting the ship into unfamiliar circumstances, into dangerous circumstances. But he trusts her to succeed, generally speaking. There's a point where Iggy has just finished kind of looking for traps in this particular area, and, you know, he's talking with, I believe, Eric and somebody else on Eric's crew. And he says... So there's a point when Iggy is working on the ship that Wyatt kind of turns off his microphone and is like, he's gonna have a company bigger than mine someday, kind of thing. There's a great moment there. And then there's a moment where after that's done and Iggy is back on the ship and safe, you know, he kind of does the same thing but in reverse. He's like, and, you know, I learned from the best, you know, such that Wyatt can't hear him. And so, you know, they both respect each other, I guess, is the point that is made by those two events. Then another thing that happens is that the subordinates are, generally speaking, kept informed of the plans that are being made, and they're allowed and encouraged to comment on them. You know, there are briefings, and it's not just a briefing between Eric and Wyatt. It's Eric's crew and Wyatt's crew, and they're all kind of back and forthing, and they have some good banter, and you know, there's a couple of jokes here and there, and they're all kind of kept apprised of where they're going, what their plans are, and, you know, if anyone has a good plan, people are like, you know, if you have if anyone here has a better plan, let me know, right, kind of thing. Because even if I'm the ostensible leader, I will acknowledge if there's a good idea, and we will do that instead. And then the last point for subordinates respecting superiors and vice versa is that one of the things that I like to do is, so Eric's kind of the overall top level planner. He figures out what the mission is. He kind of comes up with general ideas of where they're going. He owns the company. He owns the ship. But whenever there's no planning to do, he'll often take on like low level support tasks, you know, gladly, just to make sure that things get done, and that Lou doesn't have to worry about going and go grab a welding machine. He's like, no, I'll do that. I'll go grab it. I'll bring it, and that way you can get your job done. And I wasn't doing anything particularly useful anyway, so, you know, we'll get done faster. So I kind of put that in there, and I think that kind of demonstrates that as well. Part 2 of respectability. So the superiors know the strengths and weaknesses of their subordinates, and they give them appropriate tasks. So, a few examples of this. When work needs to be done to repair the ship, Wyatt assigns 2 of his crew who are good engineers to work with Lou, and they prove that they're good engineers over the course of the story. There's a point where they're in danger, and Lou is notoriously like space phobic. He's terrified of the possibility of getting sucked out into space or into vacuum and going out that way. And so there's a point where they're in danger, and Eric's like, Lou, you do these tasks because you're good at them, and it'll keep your mind off the fact that we might die in a moment. There's a point where Wyatt has brought some crew members over to help out on Eric's ship. Basically, they're going to be there in case fighting breaks out. Eric's 3-person team is not particularly skilled at fighting, and so Wyatt has some people come over and says, hey, you know, these 3 guys are going to help you in the event that you need to actually do any fighting. And that's one point of like respecting subordinates. But the other thing that happens is that Wyatt says, "Oh, by the way, this one guy that I brought, he's a good cook. You should, you should see what he can do." Which, you know, shows to me that Wyatt doesn't just know about like the skills, the particular job skills of his subordinates. He's also aware of the things that they're good at that aren't necessarily related to the job. Similarly, Eric knows that he's the only one on his crew that has any chance of being a good cook at all. And so he's like, well, I have to do it. It has to be me. And then finally, there's a point in the story where they call for backup. And Wyatt makes a particular choice of a ship to call for backup that that is based on his knowledge of that particular ship and its crew's abilities and what they're what they're best at and what they need to complete the mission. And so I think that's another good point there. Another thing about respectability. Subordinates look up to their superiors for good reason and understand that they can learn from them. I mentioned earlier that the Iggy "I learned from the best" thing is kind of an example of that. I mentioned the Bill making that mistake. Her deciding whether to try that dangerous maneuver again. She recognizes that Eric and Wyatt have both made this plan that they're trying to execute on, and that they've done their best for this plan, and that they need her skills for the plan to work. And so she's like, well, I'm just going to have to rise to the occasion. And then the other thing that happens is that the two people that Wyatt brings over as kind of like part-time engineers to help Lou out, both end up kind of growing to respect him throughout the story because they see how good he is at his job. The other thing about respectability is that disagreements happen, but they're resolved calmly, and criticisms are not seen as or used as personal attacks. So I mentioned earlier Lou's idea that he hands to the group while they're in briefing with the Orland company rep. They disagree, but they take the disagreement in good faith. They discuss it, and they both come up with some concessions to the other's argument to kind of help move things forward. There's, as I mentioned before, Eric waits for Lou to leave to go do engineering stuff before he talks to Bill about her doing this maneuver again, kind of thing. He doesn't dress her down in front of other people. He's like, look, can you do this or not? And he waits to where she's not going to be embarrassed because, oh, you failed kind of thing is being said in front of a bunch of other people. And then we have this one point where they are tracking someone and they think that they've been undetected, but they're wrong. Basically one of the characters, Wyatt, is like, oh yeah, it could have been this. And they're like, well, why didn't you mention this earlier? And he's like, well, I kind of sort of did mention it, just not super specifically. And what would we have changed if we had this, and if we thought this? And they're like, well, yeah, probably nothing. Fair enough. Okay. Plank number 3 is specialization. So, the most obvious point of specialization is that characters each have strong and weak points, right? Nobody's good at everything. So a couple of points in the story that represent that are, for instance, crew are assigned to certain tasks that they're really good at. Lou does engineering. The people that Wyatt sends over to work with Lou are good at engineering, and that's what they work on. Bill does navigation. Wyatt and Eric do the planning. Generally speaking, the people are assigned to tasks that they're good at, and they avoid the tasks that they're bad at. And when the risk comes of them meeting up with a task that they're bad at, they're like, yeah, I'm not good at that. For example, at one point they're on a resupply mission, and so they're trying to buy some parts, they're trying to buy some supplies, like food and stuff like that. And Lou is like, I might be helpful if we're talking to someone who's trying to sell us ship parts, because I'm an engineer, I can make some points here and there that can be helpful. But, I'm not going to be much help, when you're buying food. So, would it make more sense for me to go do this on my own, kind of thing? And so there's a point there about that. Number 3, Wyatt, for instance, knows the security business. He knows it inside and out. He's an old hand at it. He knows a lot of the people who work at it. He knows all the techniques, all the tips and tricks and traps. And so he knows that, and he'll give that information when it's necessary, but he leaves everything else to others who are more specialized to other tasks. Another thing is that not just that characters have strengths and weaknesses, but they actually consciously aim at tasks that match their skills. So when they're starting out and Wyatt is asking for volunteers to go search for traps on the ship, Iggy's hand shoots up. He's like, I know that I'm the best at this. I'm going to freaking do it. And then there's the fact that the two engineers, they're not engineers, but they're like semi-engineers. They have a minor in engineering kind of thing, right? The two people that go to help Lou do the engineering tasks work with him multiple times throughout the story. And, he's like, yeah, they're doing good jobs. So we managed to do some pretty good work kind of thing. Another point would be that superiors point their subordinates in the directions that also match their skills. So the superior is superior because part of the reason why he's in charge is because he knows his subordinates very well. He's like, well, you're good at this, so I'm going to send you to do this. You're good at this, so I'm going to send you to do this, that kind of thing. They recognize the skills of the people that they work with. And they even recognize when a subordinate outshines the superior in some way, right? So, for instance, Wyatt assigns a bunch. I mentioned earlier that Wyatt assigns some people to Eric's ship, the Kingfisher, when they're getting ready for some combat. He's like, these guys are really good at this, this, and this. And so, they're going to be the best people to put on your ship to deal with the possibility that you're facing. Wyatt, I mentioned earlier, Wyatt is like, he's going to have his own company someday, right? Wyatt recognizes that Iggy is not just really good at dealing with, looking for, and disarming traps. He's like, he's probably better than me because, he's a little bit more dexterous and he's a little bit more agile, whereas I'm a little bit more muscular and I can't get my arm up into these, twisty areas sometimes. He's just really good at this. And I taught him what I know, but he's taken it further than that. And then there's also a third point where Lou does some patch repairs. He's like, well, we're going to patch this up and we're going to try to run it for a few minutes and hopefully it'll hold together, right? And after they do that, Eric is like, well, it looks fine to me. It looks like it hasn't deteriorated at all. It's like, the data looks good. It's not losing thrust or whatever. And Lou was like, no, I looked at it carefully, and it does. The patches are holding, but I don't think they're going to hold for the thing that you want to do with them long term. And so we're going to need to do some more extensive repairs. And I'm recognizing that here, I did a skilled job here, but I'm also good at looking at to see whether the condition is deteriorating, kind of thing. So that's kind of, I think, an example of that. Plank 4, competence. And it seems like we hit this already, but at the same time, competence is a little different than specialization, right? So, some examples. For example, people who are in certain positions are usually there for a reason. For instance, I mentioned earlier, everyone recognizes that Wyatt is a prestigious, well-known, force to be reckoned with in the security industry. Eric handles high-level planning way better than Bill or Lou do. So, he's there for a reason. They run the ship, and he tells them where they need to go and how they need to get there, kind of thing. And he's good at that. There's, right at the end of the book, and I'm not going to spoil it all, but there is a point where Wyatt kind of talks about his perspective on the duty that he has as a security professional. And I mean, it's a really, not to toot my own horn, but I think it's a really good, short, but really hits hard speech about, his duty and the duties and what he signed up for, kind of thing. I'd almost call it, maybe I'm overstating the quality of my own writing, but it almost kind of gives me like a Heinlein kind of feel to it. Those it's like 2.5 paragraphs, but it hits me every time I read it. Another part of competence would be that problems are solved, but it takes time. I mentioned earlier, right? Oh, we saw this new thing that no one's ever seen. I can solve that in 5 minutes with technobabble. Right? In this story, I try to avoid that kind of easy solution, right? There are multiple briefings, there are multiple planning sessions. Every time that they have to, undertake a new large task, they're like, okay, how do we solve this? How do we do this? And I tried not to overdo it with too much people sitting in chairs and talking at each other. I tried to keep it relatively short, but at the same time, there is a little bit there of to kind of give you the sense of oh yeah, they had to sit. They sat and they talked about this for half an hour before they came up with something that sounded good. And then they went to some other people and they back and forth on that for another half an hour before they nailed down a concrete plan, kind of thing. And so, there are problems and they do get solved, but it takes some time, even for skilled people. When they're handed a novel problem, they're like, I'm going to have to think about this for a minute. kind of thing. And you know what? You know about this situation as well. So why don't you help me with this? And we'll work together and we'll hammer out a solution, kind of thing. Another thing that I tried to make sure that I inserted carefully in the story were like these kind of clear time extensions where repairs or clearing out traps or searching an area or something like that. I try to make sure that it's clear in the book that like these things are taking time. It's not like beep beep beep, we're done. It's like, okay, we're doing this thing, we're running a scan, right? We're going to run a coarse scan, and then we're going to, do a fine scan in this spectrum and in this spectrum. Lou, I want you on this. I'll take this. Bill, you keep us, in the same place, kind of thing. There's a lot of like, I don't make you read for half an hour while a half hour long thing happens, but I do say, oh yeah, this thing took 20 minutes or took half an hour, or yeah, we were getting ready to dock, but there was someone else in front of us in line, and so it took us 35 minutes to dock, kind of thing. There's a little bit of that in there, not too much, but I try to make it clear that like solving problems in this story is taking time. And that's important too, because time is important. There's no hard ticking clock in this story, which is another thing that I might talk about later. But like, it's clear that there is some urgency, and so they're trying to do things in such a way that they don't endanger themselves, while at the same time not wasting time. So I hope that's kind of fun. The third point about competence is that sometimes like ideas on how to solve a problem will be thought up by multiple specialized characters around the same time. So if you're presented with a problem and like, it's a navigational problem, then like the two navigators who are in the room will both be like, well, we could do this. And the other one will be like, yeah, that's a good idea. What happens if we try that, kind of thing? So there's a point where they're trying to come up with a way to do a search of multiple star systems. And Bill puts out an idea, and Max, who works for Wyatt, is like, oh, you want to do this? And Bill's like, yes, that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know if it'll work, but it would help to do the calculations, and then at least we'll have an idea, maybe. And he's like, yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, it's a bit of a crapshoot, but it's worth a try, kind of thing. And then finally, for that particular idea, there's a point where they're trying to start up the shelf drive on a ship, and I think it's Eric who walks in, and his first question to Lou is, "Oh, did you try this?" Or it might not be Eric; it might be one of Wyatt's people. And the first thing he does is like, "Oh, did you try this?" And Lou's like, "Oh yeah, I tried that. It didn't work, and here's what happened when I tried it." And so I kind of resigned myself to trying something else. And they're like, "Okay, so you did try the obvious thing first, and let's see how much we can dig into this problem and actually kind of get to the bottom to it." Okay, final plank. Sorry this is taking so long. This is way longer than I thought. But thank goodness I'm doing this in multiple videos, because I was going to do like condense these 4 videos into one thing, and it's like, ooh, that's not going to work. So, okay, final plank, fallibility. Even characters with strong specializations can and do fail sometimes. So I mentioned earlier there's this point where Bill has this major navigational failure that endangers things and possibly risks messing up the whole job. I don't want to spoil too much, but like, this does happen. And even though she's a really good pilot and a really good navigator, and I say multiple times she's really good at calculation in particular, she still makes this mistake. And it's not just that she makes this mistake, it's that there are concrete reasons why she did make this mistake that are brought up after the mistake happens. She's like, oh, it could have been this and this, or that I tried this when I should have tried this, kind of thing. And so the characters are not just fallible, but they recognize that they're fallible. And when they make a mistake, they're trying to figure out why they made that mistake and how they can fix it. I mentioned earlier that there's this thing where they are like, well, we tried to do this thing where we wouldn't be detected. And Wyatt's like, well, they probably did this. And it's like, well, Wyatt knew about it, but he didn't mention it clearly enough. And maybe they could have come up with a better plan if they had tried to plan with this particular, thing in mind. The final bit about fallibility is that characters recognize the possibility of failure, and they try to plan for contingencies. They check the quality of their work. They make sure that things are going the way they expect, right? So, for instance, after Lou fixes the engines on some ship. He doesn't just fix it and say, okay, we're good to go. He fixes it, and then there's not much. Like, it's like a sentence and a half. But it's like, oh, Lou then tested the engines under these circumstances to make sure that they would hold up. And so it's not just that he fixed it and said, we're good to go. It's that he fixed it and said, okay, let's do a quick test before we put these things through the ringer, kind of thing. I mentioned earlier that Bill has that navigation failure. When she has that first failure and she's planning the second trip, it's like, okay, well, here's the different things that I think I can apply to my second attempt. And hopefully, this will be more successful than the first one. Finally, they're tracking this target. I mean, the book is called The Pursuit of the Heliotrope, right? And so they're trying to figure out a way to track this target through space. And they're always considering, like, is there another way for us to do that? Can we go here and do this? Is there some ally of theirs nearby that we can shake down? Can we gather some information from a gas trail that they left behind? Stuff like that. Can we look at common databases of where these pickers are operating and maybe cross-reference something? They're always trying to figure out how to track their target, and they're always recognizing the possibility that the plans that they're making could fail, that they might need to come up with another way to track them. And so they're always working from a bunch of different perspectives to try to have a solution to this problem. That is a consistent problem throughout the book that they're trying to solve. So, okay. That took a lot longer than I thought, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of the work that I put into this book to try to make it kind of push a little bit against the current trope set that we have in fiction. 5 planks for characters: professionalism, specialization, respectability, competence, and fallibility, right? By putting these 5 planks into my characters, I feel like I did a good job of making them more layered, more interesting, and more representative of, like, a organization that actually knows how to work together. So that's video number 1 on the good points of Pursuit of the Heliotrope. Again, the book comes out April 7th. Ebook, hardcover, softcover versions are available. And of course on Amazon there will be samples and stuff like that. It'll also be available on other places, Barnes & Noble, etc. I don't know, I'm going to do a few of these videos talking about different elements of the book that I really enjoyed kind of being cautious about and putting some skill into. And I hope that I can kind of at least convince you that there might be something interesting in the book for you to take a look at. Maybe you'll look at the sample and say, it's not for me, but, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll say, oh, this looks like it could be fun to read. So that's kind of the hope. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you know what to do. Links in the description as usual. And yeah, have a good rest of your week. I think I'm going to try to read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And I'm not sure whether I'll be able to do that in time for a Friday video. So I don't know. I've got some plans for some other side videos to possibly do, but we're just going to have to see how it goes. So maybe I'll have another video this week, maybe not. Anyway, have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next time.